Avec les corbeaux, c'est bien. You know, this is really the fourth autobiographical book I've published. There's The Invention of Solitude, but then there's Hand to Mouth, Diable par la queue, The Red Notebook, and all the true stories. I don't think they're even all collected in one book in France, but in America it's a book, 4 suite of stories. And then this. So it's 4 different approaches. The only one inspired by death, as you say, would be The Invention of Solitude. This new book, it's not really about my mother. She's part of the story. And of course, you know, I started writing about my father about 9 days after he died. My mother had been dead for 9 years when I wrote this. So it's very, very different. This is really a book about the body, essentially, not exclusively, but essentially. That's the guiding principle of the book. And therefore, it seemed legitimate to talk about my mother, in whose body my own body began. I very purposely put them right in the middle of the book. They're the dead center, because in a way it's the most important passage in the book. And it goes on for about 20 pages, I think, these reflections on my mother and her life. Again, you know, both of my parents died suddenly, unexpectedly, without having been ill. And so each death was a shock to me. You know, most people die more slowly, but both of them were sudden. And it really caught me by surprise. And then going into that apartment and seeing her corpse on the bed was horrifying. I think it's probably one of the worst things I've ever experienced. It was something that I could not digest. It took me a long time to just assimilate it. And my impulse was to look. I had to look, but then not very long, and then I had to turn my head away. And I just couldn't look at it anymore because it was too horrifying. And I've seen other dead bodies, but when it's your mother, it's something much more powerful and unforgettable and awful. But it makes you feel, too, very close to everything that's essential about life and death. There you are with your dead parents. Big stuff. Yes. I think if anyone is really interested, obviously each book can be read separately. But the bigger experience is to read them all and see what I talk about in each one. Sometimes there's an emphasis on something in one book and then just the briefest mention of the same thing in another, because it's being written about in a different context altogether. So that's true. Now, but you see, in none of these books was I ever trying to write a complete autobiography. Each one is an approach to a certain question, and that's why when people have asked me about this new book, Winter Journal, I say no, it's not an autobiography. It's not even a memoir. What it is it's a literary work composed of autobiographical fragments. But it's not a narration. There's no chronology to it. I'm jumping around from in time and in space, and it's a kind of, how shall I put it, a musical composition. That's how I thought of it. I could have written 800 pages, but I didn't want to. I thought it should be, you know, short, 200, 250, and put in things that have stood out for me over the years. Big things and very little things too. There's some episodes that I recount that are of no consequence at all, but they're there in my mind and they seem pertinent, even though they're not extraordinarily weighty. And I should say too that after writing this book, which I did 2 years ago, I've written another book I finished recently, and it's a kind of companion to Winter Journal. So in this new book, which is called Report from the Interior, and it will be published in America in November of this year, yet another approach, and it's more the story of developing consciousness, inner life, spirituality, politics, morality, and it's constructed in a different way altogether. It has 4 parts, 4 independent parts. But I don't take the story beyond the age of about 22. I think I'm 22 in the last bit. So it's really about childhood and early youth. Well, it's not really a journal. It's not a day-to-day account, but it's something that I wrote in a rather short period of time during that very tough winter in New York of 2011, when it seemed to snow every other day. So it's really very much set in that moment, that historical moment, from January to about April of 2011. And because I wrote it in the winter, I called it Winter Journal. But of course, winter has other implications by the end of the book. See, I kept thinking of Schubert, the composer, because that beautiful cycle of songs, winter journey. So in English, you see, there's this connection. So it's a kind of journey through winter, and I even say it at some point in the English. I don't know what the translation says. I say this Winter Journal, this journey through winter, and so I think it becomes clear what I'm trying to do in the original version. But then again, in thinking about this, the book, of course, is concerned with aging. That's one of the themes. It's not by any means the central motivation of the book, but it's one of them. And if one assumes that a life these days on the average is about 80 years, well, if you divide it into 4 seasons, it's 20 years per season. So since I've passed 60, there's no question that I'm in the 4th season. The thing about winter, if you get through winter, not everybody does. Some people barely get through summer. But if you get through winter, it's open. You don't know how long it's going to be. 20 years is not guaranteed. But maybe you get 5 years or 10 or 30 or 40 even. So it's an open question. But there's no doubt that I'm in a new phase of my life, and I think that's how the book ends, really. It's interesting, to think that in a lot of these autobiographical works, they have been fragmentary. But when I think about it, and I'm thinking about it now for the first time ever, my novels do not function that way. The novels are, there might be breaks, ruptures here and there, but there is a feeling of continuous narration. But not in the nonfiction. It's an interesting point. I've never thought about it. But you see, the way I wanted to set this up is with the fragments. You feel that there's a kind of associative thinking going on, that one memory will inspire another memory, and that's in fact how it really happened. Although I must say that I knew what I was doing in advance with this book. I didn't discover it as I was doing it. I made a list of all the things I wanted to talk about. I pretty much knew what I wanted to be in the book. Sometimes I took things out. I cut maybe 50 pages of material that finally seemed extraneous. There was this tremendous urge to write about other people and encounters with other people. But every time I put it in, it seemed out of place. So I put all that material to the side. And so it necessarily is about me. And it's not even about my children, for example. It's not about a lot of things. The only relationships in the book are, the only serious ones are the ones with my wife, Siri, and with my mother. Those are about the only two. It's strange how you construct a work and it seems to demand its own shape, its own form. So you follow that. But I did have a sense of where I was going with it. It's strange to me that I've written these 5 books now that are autobiographical, because in effect I'm really not terribly interested in myself. I don't even find myself interesting. I've had a very ordinary life in so many ways. Nothing really extraordinary has happened to me. Luckily, I'm glad. I haven't lived through, violent war. I haven't lived through a pestilence or an epidemic, a flood, a couple of hurricanes, but nothing of any, tragic proportions. So I look at myself just as an example of a human being. I'm the laboratory rat that I'm examining, because I know my story better than anyone else's. The book was written in the second person this time. And I jumped into it that way. I was writing in the second person. And about 10 or 15 pages in, I said, why am I doing this? Why does it feel right to be doing it this way? And I stopped and thought about it, and I realized that the first person, which is the traditional voice of autobiographical work, for this particular case would have been too exclusionary, because I wasn't interested in my autobiography. Third person, which is another option, and it's something I used in The Invention of Solitude in the second part of the book. That was possible, but in this case, I felt it would have been too distant. Second person seemed right, because it allowed me to separate myself from myself a little bit, but to address myself, enter into a kind of intimate dialogue with myself. At the same time, I think subliminally, the presence of the you in the book unconsciously implicates the reader. And I think my goal in the book was to, on the one hand, just try to describe what it feels like to be alive in your own skin, but secondly, to share this experience with the reader, whom I would hope would, based on the things I'm talking about, which I think are very ordinary things that everyone has experienced, that the reader would think back on his or her own life. Oh yes, I remember when I had stitches when I hit my head. I remember when I broke my leg. I remember when I was in a car accident. I remember this and that. I remember the dawning of my sexual life, for example. All these things that are common to all of us. So it's a weird book. I mean, it doesn't fit any convention that I know of. I can't justify it, because there are names in the book. Jean-Louis Trintignant, Michael Naumann, my German publisher with whom I went on that trip, which is described at the end. And I think there might be 2 or 3 other names. I think I wanted to make it kind of depersonalize it a little bit and make it more universal. I mean, I'm talking about specific people, but the names simply didn't seem to matter. I mean, when I'm talking about in early, that scene in Dublin when I finished making my film, I didn't even mention the name of the film. It's Lulu on the Bridge. I don't mention the name of the actress, Mira Sorvino. I don't mention the name of her boyfriend, who at the time was Quentin Tarantino. I mean, he was the one in the bar with us. But it just seems, too many names, it feels like gossip. And that's not what I wanted to do. So I just instinctively cut out all the names but one or two that seemed necessary to mention by name. Montaigne is the great model for me, and he was the only writer I was thinking about while I was doing this book. You know, I read him when I was very young, and I even had a tremendously good course at Columbia University. It was a seminar on Montaigne, only Montaigne, and for a whole semester there were 10 of us around a table with the greatest Montaigne scholar in the United States, Donald Frame, who translated Montaigne. His translations are the best. He wrote a biography of Montaigne, and this man knew everything about him. And I must say, it was one of the great university experiences of those 4 years. It was a tremendous class, and so I read everything, you know, in the Pléiade, and I wrote 2 or 3 very long papers on Montaigne, which I rediscovered recently. I mean, one of them is 35 pages long on Montaigne. So I've been thinking about him since I was 19 or 20 years old. And the impact has been enormous, especially in my autobiographical work. He's the father of the whole thing. Yeah. It was a small thing, but you see, that's what I mean. There are these small things that really are of not tremendous significance, but they stick with you. You can't get them out of your head. I mean, there are other things I could have written about, but that seemed particularly pertinent, that one. And then there's the, you know, the thing that I think about all the time too, is that baby that might have been born, you know, 45 years ago, that wasn't. So yes, but Rousseau, I love the Confessions, but I don't think I was really inspired by them. He's a much more problematical character than Montaigne, and he's a liar too, and a charming one, I must say. And but you know, I really didn't. To the best of my ability, I told the truth about everything that I'm recounting. I loved that book when I read it. Again, I was 20, 21 when I read it. And I'm sure that book is a kind of, yes, it's a cousin to this. It's all part of this kind of writing, each one of us having approached it in a different way, but for sure that book had a big impact on my thinking about how to write. It was a very exciting book to read when you're young. Huh? Yes, I thought it was fundamental. Otherwise, the book would have been too abstract. And I really wanted to make it concrete, have it based in the body. Yes, there was no question. I needed to do that. And that's why I even talk about, you know, sexual awakening too. I mean, which is a fundamental part of growing up and becoming a human being. But nobody really talks about it that much. So I wanted to talk about it. Not at length, but, you know, it's again an element in the book. Place has always been, and space, have been fundamental elements in all the work I've done, nonfiction and fiction. You know, to such a degree that it's almost been unconscious. But since the beginning, since I started publishing, it's very fascinating to me that architects have been very interested in my work. And I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to write about architecture, about which I know very little. And a few years ago, at the City College in New York City, I was invited to give the Lewis Mumford lecture. Now, Mumford, I don't know if you know who he was. He was a great American intellectual. He wrote about cities and space, just these and architecture. And so what I did, I said, I can't do a lecture on this. And the man who invited me said, no, do whatever you want, do a reading. And what I did was, I looked through my books and found passages talking about rooms, houses, cities, and landscapes in the country. And it was fascinating. And Siri said that it absolutely changed how she thinks about my work, to hear these things pulled out. So it continues in this book, and place and space seem to me fundamental. Follies is right at the end.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole book is informed by 9/11, but I don't say so. But you feel it's chronologically moving up to that date. And that book was a kind of, it was a comedy, the first true comedy I've written. And I was inspired by something Billy Wilder, the director, said, which was, when you're feeling very good about yourself and things are going well, that's the time to write a tragedy. And when you're feeling miserable, really awful about everything, do a comedy. And I was feeling so bad for so long after these attacks that I thought, well, this is the time to write the funny book. Yeah. I've written about it, though, in essays. In fact, you mentioned Art Spiegelman earlier, it must be about 9 or 10 years ago now. He had a big show of his work for the New Yorker magazine, but in Italy, and I wrote the catalog. And there I talk at length about 9/11, because he did that beautiful, moving cover of the New Yorker, the black on black cover. So yes, no, I have addressed it. In fact, the day of 9/11, my German friend, Michael Naumann, whom I mentioned in the book, who eventually left Rowohlt, where he was the head of the publishing company, and he became an editor at Die Zeit, the German weekly newspaper, very good paper. And he called me on 9/11, around, it must have been about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, New York time. So about 4 hours after the planes hit. And he said, we're doing an issue, it's coming up. Please write a piece today, and the newspaper's coming out in 2 days. And I didn't want to do it. I said, well, I'll think about it. And then I was walking around the neighborhood. It was so grim in Brooklyn. I can tell you that, all the debris was coming. The wind was carrying it to Brooklyn. So everybody was walking around the street like this, with handkerchiefs over their faces. And it was also the first day that our daughter, went to high school. The first time she took the subway alone from Brooklyn to Manhattan. That's what we were worried about that morning. She was 14. But at 4 o'clock, I sat down and I wrote a page and a half about what was going on. And at that point, we didn't know how many people were dead. We didn't know what was going to happen. But I do remember the last line of the piece, which was, and so the 21st century begins. And so already, even on the day it was happening, I had some kind of perspective on the event. So yeah, I have written about it, but not a lot. And I certainly haven't written a novel about it. I haven't been thinking about that. Tell me. It was a metaphor about his whole life. You know, walking towards a promised land that does not exist. And the going is what matters, not arriving, because you never will get to where you're trying to go. I remember in the Book of Illusions, there's a little passage in which Zimmer, the narrator, is driving in a car, and his mind is wandering, and he starts thinking about that. How many times have I stubbed my toe? How many times have I, tied my shoelaces? This kind of thing. So it's something that comes to me every now and again. But see, I'm very fascinated with lists and the use of the list in literature. I guess Rabelais is probably the first one to do it. But one of the great list makers of all time was James Joyce. And it's such a beautiful way of encapsulating enormous range of experience in a very compact space. And you can't do it too much. But every once in a while in the book, I just let it go. Mm-hmm. And I think because so much of this book is about the rhythms and the music, so it changes, it speeds up, it slows down. There's a thing this big, and then there are 10 pages of something else, and then another little thing. And so it's all about the musical composition of the book. Mm. But it was a turning point in my life. And I've talked about it briefly in interviews over the years, but never really sat down and described the whole thing. So I felt that was essential. Because again, it's all about the body. I mean, these bodies taught me something about language. And I think it was this, and because I don't say it in the book. But I think up until that point, I had a different idea about how to write. I was writing poems, and I had written fiction, this much fiction, 1,000 pages of unfinished novels when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I just wasn't grown up enough to finish them. I didn't know what I was doing yet. But there are seeds in all those pages of books I wrote later. I think what I was striving for was a kind of perfection all the time. I put so much pressure on myself. And so, in a sense, I was writing in a state of tension. And then so tense that I became blocked. This performance, for whatever reason, it could have been something else that might have, unleashed me, but it happened to be that particular experience. I suddenly understood that it didn't matter. I'll never be perfect. And every act of writing is a failure. And just to fail in the best way you possibly can. As Beckett says, fail better. And I think he had his finger right on the whole question. I just opened up, and I realized I can do anything. I can write about anything, and just simply do the best I can, and maybe something interesting will come out of all this. And how long ago was that? 1978. So it's 35 years ago almost. It's a long time, half a life. Oh, come on.